It was 2 a.m. when Trevor Morrison, the new president of our HOA, had my work truck towed from my own driveway. He claimed it was a violation of parking restrictions. But here's the kicker. I found out that Trevor, the same guy who towed my truck, had parked his 32-foot cabin cruiser on HOA property for over 11 months, in direct violation of the same covenants he used against me. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. At 6 a.m., I hired a towing company to remove his boat while he stood there, helpless, watching from his driveway. Karma, right? Let me take you back to how this all started. My name is Daniel, and I'm 61 years old. I run a commercial electrical contracting business that I built from the ground up over 37 years. I started as an apprentice at 24, and over time, I grew my business to employ 12 electricians. I've been around the block, seen it all. 2 years ago, my wife Linda and I decided to downsize, so we moved into Pinewood Trails, a quiet, well-kept community just outside Tampa. We thought it was a peaceful place to enjoy our later years. Pinewood Trails is a neighborhood of about 180 homes. It was the perfect spot, nice, quiet, and with HOA rules that were fair. The HOA had reasonable guidelines, and honestly, for the first 18 months, I had no issues at all. Every evening, I'd park my work truck, a white Ford F-350 crew cab, right in my driveway. It was the truck I used for my business, with my company's name and phone number painted on the side. Standard stuff for any contractor. It was clean, professional, and well within the HOA's guidelines. According to the covenants, work vehicles of a certain size were allowed, and my truck, at 9,900 pounds, was under the weight limit. Then came Trevor Morrison. The man was 53 years old, a real estate broker who lived just a few houses down in a lakefront property. He was elected as HOA president in September. Trevor ran on a platform promising stricter enforcement of HOA rules. He claimed the neighborhood needed tougher leadership to combat violations that were supposedly lowering property values. He won by a narrow margin, convincing a lot of the older residents that the neighborhood was going downhill. His first action? Sending violation notices to 23 residents, including me. On October 7th, I received my notice. It claimed I was violating Pinewood Trails Covenant Section 6.2, stating that commercial vehicles with external business signage weren't allowed to be parked overnight in driveways. Now, I knew I was in the clear. The covenant didn't prohibit business signage on permitted vehicles, and my truck was well under the weight limit. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent a letter back, stating that my truck was legal under the covenants and asked Trevor to review the rules. Trevor's response came 3 days later. The truck had to be removed, or it would be towed. He argued that the spirit of the covenant prohibited business signage, even though it wasn't written anywhere in the rules. I called him up, and we went back and forth. I pointed out that the covenants didn't say anything about signage. His stance? That trucks with business logos ruined the residential vibe of the neighborhood. I attended the next board meeting, hoping for a fair hearing. But when my turn came to speak, Trevor was already sitting at the head of the table like he owned the place. I laid out my case, pointing to the exact language in the covenants that allowed my truck. And then, just when I thought things were looking up, a retired attorney named Margaret Foster, who was also on the board, sided with Trevor. The covenant wasn't about the letter of the law, they argued, but about the spirit of it. I wasn't about to back down, so I threatened to sue if my truck was towed. On October 22nd, at 2 a.m., I heard a tow truck in my driveway. I rushed out to stop them, but it was too late. My truck was already being hauled away. I immediately called Linda, and we both just stared at the empty driveway in disbelief. Trevor didn't care about the covenants. He only cared about flexing his power. The next day, I paid the $460 towing fee under protest and immediately called my lawyer, Robert Shin. Robert agreed that the HOA had violated its own covenants. But I wanted more than just the towing fee back. I wanted Trevor to feel the consequences of his hypocrisy. I began investigating Trevor's property and found something that made my blood boil. He owned a 32-foot cabin cruiser, and he had parked it in his backyard, visible from the street, for 11 months. The HOA covenants clearly stated that boats, RVs, and trailers could not be stored on residential property for more than 72 hours if they were visible from the street. Trevor had been violating this rule for months while sending out violation notices to others. I documented everything, took photos from different angles, and gathered evidence. I sent a formal complaint to the HOA board, pointing out Trevor's violation. Their response? Denied. They claimed his property was in compliance, which was absurd. The boat was still sitting there, visible to everyone. I called Robert again. He confirmed that selective enforcement was a breach of fiduciary duty. So, I did something Trevor would never expect. I hired a towing company, Sunshine Towing, and asked them to tow Trevor's boat. I presented all my evidence, and after some initial hesitation, the owner of Sunshine Towing, Frank, agreed. We scheduled the tow for 6 a.m. on November 4th. I wanted Trevor to witness the whole thing. When the tow truck arrived at Trevor's house, I was parked down the street, watching. Trevor came running out his house, wearing sweatpants, shouting, "You can't tow my boat." Frank handed him a notice, explaining that the boat was being impounded because it violated the HOA rules. Trevor started to panic, but by the time he could make a call, his boat was already being pulled down the street. That moment, watching Trevor helplessly watch his boat get towed, was the sweet taste of justice. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing him the same disrespect he had shown me. The satisfaction of knowing he experienced the exact same thing he had done to me was enough. Sure enough, Trevor called me later that morning, furious. He threatened to have me arrested for theft, but I reminded him that I had simply applied the same rules he had used to tow my truck. I told him to take it up with his attorney. The next day, things escalated quickly. Trevor called the police, but they couldn't intervene. Trevor's attorney sent me a threatening letter, but Robert fired back, detailing Trevor's selective enforcement and how he had violated the covenants. Word spread quickly, and the other board members, who were completely unaware of Trevor's actions, were appalled. Margaret Foster, the retired attorney, called an emergency board meeting. They learned that Trevor had abused his authority, and Margaret moved to rescind the violation against my truck, reimburse my towing costs, and issue a violation notice to Trevor. Trevor was forced to resign 3 days later. The new leadership under Margaret was a breath of fresh air. Rules were enforced fairly, and Pinewood Trails became a much healthier place to live. I learned something important through this whole ordeal. Sometimes, the only way to deal with a bully who abuses power is to give them a taste of their own medicine. It's not about revenge, it's about fairness. And in the end, fairness always wins. The real lesson? If you're ever in a situation where the rules are being applied unfairly, document everything, know your rights, and stand up for what's right. You might just be the one to bring about real change. So what do you think? Should I have let it slide? Or was my response justified? Have you ever had to deal with an unfair HOA? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up to HOA abuse.